You are now listening to a podcast made in collaboration with the Copenhagen College Radio.
Hey everybody, thanks for tuning in to episode 73 of the Social Media and Politics podcast, bringing you expert insights into how social media is changing the political game. I'm your host, Michael Becerra, political scientist at the University of Copenhagen. Remember, you can connect with the show on Twitter at SMNP Podcast and sign up for the newsletter on our website, socialmediaandpolitics.org. All right, y'all. Thank you again for tuning in. Today, I have the pleasure of welcoming Dr. Alice Marwick to the show. Dr. Marwick is an assistant professor of communication at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, and in 2017, she co-authored a report with Rebecca Lewis entitled Media Manipulation and Disinformation Online. And this report is just a fascinating and comprehensive look at how far-right groups are using the internet and social media technologies to put fringe, extremist, often very racist views into the mainstream media. And in this interview, we're going to dive into who are these actors, what are their ideologies, and what type of strategies are they using to promote these very fringe opinions and get them into mainstream discourse. So I definitely encourage you to check out the report. I'll put a link to it in the show notes. But without further ado, let's dive right into it. My guest is Dr. Alice Marwick, assistant professor of communication at UNC Chapel Hill. Dr. Marwick, thanks for taking the time out and welcome to the Social Media and Politics podcast.
It's great to be here. Thanks for having me.
Can you start out by giving us a brief introduction into your previous research on social media and how you got interested in exploring these darker corners of the internet?
Sure. So I've been studying social media now for about 15 years, and most of my work has to do with self-presentation and relationships online. I'm interested in how people present themselves online to gain social status and gain attention. And I'm also really interested in the interplay between what people choose to reveal online and what they choose to conceal online. So my first book was about self-presentation tactics that people use to gain status. And I was interested not in how social media was being used for like positive democratic ways, which was the primary discourse in the mid-2000s when I was doing my work, but how it was used to sort of reinforce hierarchical social structures. And my second book, which I'm writing right now, looks at privacy as a political issue. And I'm interested in how the harms of privacy violations that are typically brought about by social media and data-driven technologies disproportionately affect people who are marginalized in other areas of their life. And I usually have like a bunch of different research streams going on. I really like to collaborate with people. I'm pretty easy to convince to, if you're someone who's doing an awesome project and you want to rope me in on it, I'm super easy to convince. But this project came about in the months running up to the 2016 election. I was a fellow at the Data and Society Research Institute, and I was on sabbatical between my job at Fordham and my job now at UNC. And a team had started looking at the far right because we had started to notice that these sort of far right messages and conspiracy theories and hoaxes were showing up more and more in mainstream media. And so the team started systematically tracking what was going on 4chan and 8chan. We started with the sort of Hillary Clinton Podesta emails and kind of went on from there. And then after the election, the team was kind of going out and trying to drum up research funding and talk to different people who were really concerned about the aftermath of the 2016 election. And we realized that there was very little understanding of some of the things that we had documented in our research. So I wrote this report that was originally supposed to be just like a 20-page like explainer that we could give as a white paper to people that were giving more specific talks to. And working with Becca Lewis, who was my research assistant at the time and became my co-author, it sort of ballooned into this giant 100-page report that opened a lot of doors for us and also sort of put us in touch with a lot of other people working on different aspects of this problem.
Right. And so let's dig into what the report actually looks at. And I want to kind of break it down in terms of the actors you're looking at, their mission, and then the platforms that they're using. So first, looking at the actors, as you note in the report, you're investigating what could kind of blanketly be referred to as the alt-right, but it's actually a more complex ecosystem, right? So can you describe the type of subcultures the report is looking at and how they might be considered similar or different from one another?
So the report looks at a number of different kind of actors, and we usually tend to use the term far right rather than alt right because we do find that these groups have a shared political commitment. But they're not all even political. We looked at internet trolls, not only the people who are doing explicit political action on boards like 4chan and 8chan, but people who are just kind of pranksters and are looking for attention or looking to cause trouble. We also looked at a number of ideologically driven groups, so specifically white nationalists who are generally what we would consider to be the alt-right, people who are motivated by this emphasis on racial superiority and elimination of immigration, things like that, but also men's rights groups, men's rights activists, pickup artists, and people who are conspiracy theorists. And the conspiratorial aspect of these groups is really interesting because conspiracy theories sort of run through all of the groups, that they tend to go towards like these extreme and often sensationalist or fantastical ideas for why something is happening. But there's two things I think that are really interesting about these particular communities, whether we're talking about trolls or gamergaters or men's rights activists or white nationalists. The first is that they tend to become homophilous, meaning that as people in these communities become more extreme, the moderate voices disappear, meaning that it really does push people in these groups to the fringes. And so they get kind of like fringier and fringier. And the second is that they share a set of political commitments that we might consider to be like very far right or very conservative. And a lot of these have to do with a fear of a decline in America, or specifically white America. There's a lot of dislike of feminism, a dislike of immigration, a dislike of people of color. There's this conspiratorial thinking, but there's also a real hatred of elites and mainstream media and mainstream politics. So even though within this sort of amalgam of people, you might have different emphases or different issues that are their focus, so they might differ in terms of what issue they focus on, they share these sort of extremist political commitments. And because a lot of these groups are very agile or networked, like they're not, you don't get a membership card to be a part of 4chan. These groups sort of coalesce around issues and then they disappear and then they coalesce around something else. They're very agile. They're able to be mobilized sort of at a moment's notice. So even though we tried to kind of break them down in terms of, you know, this is the alt-right, these are the men's rights activists, et cetera, it's a lot less clear than that. There's a lot more overlap and there's a lot of nebulousness. Like there's people who would never consider themselves part of the alt-right or would claim that they're not racist or they're not anti-Semitic. But I would argue that they accept white nationalist ideas in their online spaces, or they are at least open to those kinds of conversations happening in the same places that they're having their conversations.
Right. And a lot of these conversations are coded, right? There's a sort of lingo or, you know, even getting down to how many spaces you put between words that kind of signals your status, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's a big difference between how a lot of these groups behave in their own spaces versus how they behave in spaces like Facebook or Reddit or Twitter, which they see as a way to get out their own ideas. Almost as a means for publicity. So we were tracking people in like private Discord groups or on Gab AI or on 4chan or in the message boards of the Daily Stormer. And in those spaces, people are a lot more candid about their beliefs and they're often a lot more honest. Whereas when they're talking about them on places like Facebook, like a big Facebook group that might be a far-right Facebook group, but not necessarily a white nationalist group, that's where you get into a lot of this coded messaging or dog whistle messaging, where there are certain things that indicate other things to people in the know, but they're not necessarily observable by people who don't have access to all those discursive resources.
Right, right. And then getting to the idea of these actors' mission. I mean, I think what you argue in the report is that a common trope is they're trying to manipulate the mainstream media. So could you break down for us what media manipulation is and why these groups are engaging in it?
We define media manipulation as groups exploiting vulnerabilities in mainstream media to amplify extremist messaging. And there's a couple of reasons why we define it this way. The first is that a lot of these groups are, as I said, are very fringy. So they can get a much larger audience through the mainstream media than they would through their own blogs or podcasts or, you know, Twitter accounts or whatnot. And even though most of the people who see an extremist message online, you know, the vast majority of people are going to say, I don't agree with that. I don't believe in that. They're not looking for that 99%. They're looking for the 1% of people who might agree with them. And they don't care whether the stories that get into mainstream media are fake or they're debunked or they are denounced by whoever's reporting on them. They're just looking for exposure. The second thing is that a lot of the groups that we're talking about have a real antipathy towards the mainstream media. So they're trying to make the mainstream media look bad. And so often they're playing these pranks, or they're trying to troll the media into believing something that's pretty silly, like the idea that the OK sign, for example, is a white supremacist signal. And then when the mainstream media falls for it, it makes them look less reliable, and it sort of increases the cycle of distrust in the mainstream media. When we talk about vulnerabilities in the mainstream media, we have to think about the fact that most journalistic norms are done with the best of intentions, right? So the idea of showing both sides of an issue, let's take that. Obviously, there's a reason why you want to show both sides of the issue. It's so that journalists don't cover things only from a liberal perspective or a conservative perspective or whatever. In reality, media scholars have documented that it's really a limited number of beliefs that you see on mainstream media. Like they call that the Overton window, which is the range of acceptable ideas that we see in mainstream political discourse. And by setting up this dichotomy between both sides of an issue, what a lot of far-right groups have been able to do is get themselves on the table as one of those sides. There was a famous situation in which Richard Spencer went on CNN, and there was a chyron underneath that said, alt-right founder asks, are Jews people? And that's not typically an issue that we felt had two sides, right? Like, that's no longer something that we debate in society. It's no longer considered socially acceptable to be openly and flagrantly anti-Semitic. And yet, by positioning himself as just one side of an issue, you open up these angles and these issues for debates that had previously been foreclosed upon. There's also this sense of false equivalency that when the far right does something, often the media is scrambling to find something similar that the far left is doing, and often they're not. And we can talk about why that is later. And so when Trump was talking about how there's good people on both sides, he's playing into that sense of false equivalence and that sense to amplify both sides of an issue. Another vulnerability we see in the media is the fact that most journalists are working with a lack of resources, and they're sourcing a lot of stories from social media. And the far-right actors that we identified are extremely masterful at using all levels of social media to put out their messaging, which means that they're often able to sort of create these tempests in a teacup and create smoke where there is no fire. And journalists will pick on that and cover it, even if it's not really a story. Another vulnerability we see, and this is still ongoing, is the fact that a lot of social media sites will recommend things algorithmically based on other pieces of content that have generated interest. And this is especially salient on YouTube, which has been criticized greatly in the last 2 or 3 years for pushing people towards extremist content. And the motivation there is usually to try to radicalize people, or what the far right calls red pilling, to get them to come around to their way of thinking on a particular issue.
Right. The red pilling issue is a really interesting one. And I wanted to ask, to what extent are these groups just manipulating the media to get exposure? Or have you seen them actually using social media or mainstream media in order to radicalize certain groups?
I think it's both. I think on one hand, if you get exposure, you give people ideas of what to look for if they are maybe interested. For example, Dylan Roof, the Charleston shooter, was famously radicalized because he typed the term black on white crime into Google. And that's a terminology that's only used by white supremacists. It's not used by criminologists. It's not used by the Justice Department. It's not used by, the cops, nothing. So when you type black on white crime into Google, you get nothing but white supremacist propaganda. So on one hand, it's about seeding the mainstream with those kinds of terms so that people can discover white supremacist or extremist content using search engines or digital tools.
Because one of the things I found was interesting in the report, and since then I've sort of trolled around a bit on these forums, and it almost seems like they're preying on young men's sort of insecurities about their masculinity. That gender aspect becomes so pronounced in just reading some of these forums. How do you think that fits in?
I think that's an absolutely fascinating part of this whole puzzle, because often when we think about the alt-right or the far-right, we think about race, religion. We don't think about gender. But gender, I think, is the biggest unexplored dynamic in extremist content. Partly it's because many of these groups come out of these early roots of the men's rights movement and Gamergate, where you're looking at feminism as a sort of straw man that is responsible for all the ills in the world. Partly it's because young men are the people who I think are most likely to engage with these ideas because they're being spread in communities that attract young men, like video game fans, right? Or these kind of discussion forums where young men who are maybe not super successful in their social lives or their careers are coming to sort of commiserate with each other. And what's interesting is these are the same types of young men that other radical movements in other parts of the world will also try to recruit, is men who are feeling lost, that they feel that they don't have an identity, that they feel that there is no room for them in the modern era or whatnot. And the messages that the far right has engineered to appeal to young men is really, really effective at giving them this sense of pride in being a man or pride in being a white man specifically, and a narrative of who to blame for whatever their personal, problem is. You blame feminism, you blame people of color, you blame immigrants, you blame trans people, you blame liberal elites, you blame Democrats, you blame the Jews, right? And so there's this whole sort of narrative that you can buy into that gives you a framework not only to explain the problems in your life and blame them on someone else, but to give you an alternate framework of identity that's positive rather than negative. And I think that when we're thinking about combating radicalization, part of it has to be taking this into account and taking into account the fact that you can't just tell people being part of these communities is bad. You have to give them something positive as an alternative.
Right. And as you note in the report, I mean, a lot of these young men who either stumble upon or get recruited into these type of spaces tend to be nerds or geeks, and meaning they're tech savvy. So I think that gets to that idea you were talking about earlier of organizing and sort of disappearing very quickly. So I wanted to ask, what are the main strategies that these groups are using to manipulate the media, particularly in terms of social media?
So many far-right groups really embrace what Henry Jenkins would refer to as participatory culture, in that they are working together to hone their messaging. They will share literature that they think might help other people create, a political message or a prank or a hoax. They're very iterative in the content that they create. Like, they'll work on a meme together. They'll sort of launch it as someone would like a PR campaign or a marketing strategy. The fact that these movements are very networked means that you can usually find like-minded people to amplify something. And if you can't find like-minded people, then you can find a bot network that will amplify it for you. And because these groups are agile and they're able to coalesce around breaking news and issues, they can often get out in front of something as it's breaking news and put forth their own frame or their own way of sort of encapsulating an issue. So one thing that they're really good at is coming up with new terms for old things. So the alt-right, for example, or race realism, which is just a new way to talk about like biological racism, like racism based in some sort of like unequal biology, which has been completely debunked by biologists, anthropologists, sociologists. But they've managed to sort of dust it off and put a fresh coat of paint on it and call it race realism and put it out there into the mainstream. One of the other things that these groups do is they're really good at working up the chain of media outlets. So they'll brainstorm these sort of strategies or these hoaxes or these ideas in their little subcultural groups where there aren't a lot of looky-loos or there aren't a lot of outsiders. And then they'll use Twitter or Facebook to amplify these stories with the goal of getting like a local news outlet or a blog to pick something up. And once it gets a lot of coverage there, it usually jumps to the hyper-partisan far-right press. And often from there, it jumps to like Fox News or even sometimes to mainstream Republican politicians. So you have this kind of chain where there's these very subcultural, often very hostile spaces for organizing or for brainstorming, all the way up to, a congressperson retweeting something that has its roots in a far-right group or in some kind of far-right conspiracy theory.
Right. So it kind of works up this ladder. It's not just a direct, from these boards like 4chan and 8chan directly into the mainstream. It's sort of an iterative process.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's where I think the participation and the network come in, because in order to craft a message that will get mainstream acceptance, you have to be pretty good at things like memes and internet culture and understanding what will catch on and what won't. And they're totally happy to throw 100 things against the wall and see what sticks. And then if one of those 100 sticks, that's great. So one of the ways that we found that messages are spread the most that are far-right messages is through image macros, which are really hard to detect algorithmically, and they're also often very ambiguous. So you'll see something that's generated by a far-right group in a sort of mainstream right-wing group, and it's not necessarily an extremist message. It's pretty mainstream conservative, like, let's restrict immigration, or let's reinforce the southern border, for example. Like, this is Trump's strategy right now, right? So it's a very mainstream Republican idea. And then they'll sneak some things in those image macros or those memes that are more extreme. And so they're able to sort of have this ambiguous presence where they can move between mainstream and extremist sites and hopefully get some people, inculcated into their particular way of thinking.
And I'm curious to ask about your methodological approach. I mean, how did you actually go and study these groups?
So we had a team of people doing data collection, and Becca and I were doing basically secondary research and then working with our team to look at the primary research. So we used a lot of secondary sources. Like, if you look in the report, it's extremely, I think, well researched. We have hundreds and hundreds of sources, and we read everything from academic literature to white papers put out from like the Southern Poverty Law Center to things in political communication to, New York Times, Wall Street Journal articles. So all types of secondary sources. But then we had this observation that was going on the message boards. We had something like 9 to 10 months at the time of screen caps and data gathered from 4chan, 8chan, and the Daily Stormer. We were also in a bunch of small Discord communities, like, we're just kind of lying low, right? Like, not participating, but just kind of listening to what people were doing. We were on Gab. We were, Becca follows far-right influencers, so she was following a lot of them. And a lot of this data was gathered pretty systematically. So we were gathering, for example, far-right memes that were shared on the Daily Stormer, and we ended up with a corpus of about 1,000 of them. So when we were looking into the strategies that they used on memes, we had this corpus of 1,000 far-right memes that we could use to come up with our conclusions. So it is all very empirically based, but the problem is it's really hard to study these far-right groups. If I hadn't been on sabbatical and I hadn't been devoting myself to this 100%, I don't know if I would have been able to do the type of in-depth fieldwork that we did, especially with a team. There's a couple of reasons for this. First of all, these sites are very unpleasant to look at. There's often very sexist, racist, homophobic, transphobic, anti-Semitic content in front of your face every day. If it's not pictures and memes, it's the language. And, I'm a woman, I'm a feminist, and seeing this like really negative, horrible talk about women every day was very hard. We had a lot of Jewish members of our team who really had a hard time looking at the anti-Semitic content as well. The second is that this stuff moves very quickly. So this isn't a situation which you can check in with your field site like once or twice a week. You pretty much have to be looking at it every day, because a Discord will get shut down and then they'll all move somewhere else. They'll get no platform from one platform and then they'll go somewhere else. And you really have to be looking at the pulse of these groups in order to find out where they are, which is where they're having these insider conversations. So I'm not at all in touch with where these extremist groups are as I was, 2 years ago when I was doing the research for this report. I think it would be very hard for me to write this report again today. It really required immersion in these subcultures in order to understand their dynamics. I'd also add that I was lucky enough to be working with a great team of people who I could, ask, like, help me parse this thing, or let's figure out how this works. We had people in giving us talks who studied many other aspects of the far right. So this really, even though my name and Becca's name are the only ones on the report, this report really is the culmination of a good year of data gathering by a team of people at Data and Society.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that seems to unite this group with their different agendas and, missions is that they tend to have a worship of technology. And I was wondering if you could sort of expand on that and describe why these groups tend to be particularly fond of the internet and sort of technology in general.
Well, I think there's two reasons for that. The first is that a lot of these people feel like they're internet natives, or that they grew up on the internet. And this is probably the most true for the sort of 4chan, 8chan people, but it's true for other people in these groups as well. That internet culture, memes, trolling, the lols, all that stuff is just kind of like the air that they breathe. They understand weird internet stuff. That's how they express themselves. this very sort of ironic but also nihilistic sense. And because they're very internet savvy, they're really, really comfortable with picking up a brand new social media site or a brand new platform and sort of twisting it to their own needs and then dropping it. So, right now I've been looking at TikTok, which is a platform that a lot of academics haven't even heard of. And it's mostly like viral dance videos from teenagers, for example, but there's like all this far right content on there. And I'm really interested, like, how does this happen so quickly? It's almost like they seamlessly are able to keep up with the cutting edge of internet technologies just because they're so comfortable. The second thing is that I think there's a big overlap between people involved in these communities and people in the tech industry. And we saw this with the James Damore memo, where he sort of claimed that the reason that there aren't a lot of women at Google is because women are just not very good at googly things like math and science, which has also been debunked. And in my early work, I looked at how engineers really love clarity. They hate ambiguity. They love numbers. They like facts. They don't like feelings. And there's this whole frame of the far right as being more logical or being more rational than the liberal left, which are seen as being like irrational and hysterical and crazy. And there's obviously like a very gendered element to that. But there's the sense that if you're a computer engineer, you're somebody who works with cutting edge technologies, then you are the person who's rational. You're right. And so you're looking at all this evidence. And from this evidence, you're coming to this conclusion about gender inferiority or racial inferiority or superiority or whatnot. And so it just makes sense to you, right? There's a logic there. So I think the fact that you have both those types of groups of people, you have both these sort of trolly, teenage, native internet people, and you have these sort of googly, Silicon Valley types, means that there's this shared love of technology. And also technology is sort of like a liberator, or technology as something that will sort of save us all.
Yeah, it's interesting you bring up this Silicon Valley element because, there seems to be a sort of leftist culture in Silicon Valley around, building open communities across the globe, et cetera. And so it brings me to my next question, which is, where is the far left in all of this? We see in political campaigning that, the right might do something and the left a couple of years might follow or vice versa. But this type of internet activity seems to be something that's particularly and sort of only with the far right. So I just wanted to ask, is there no equivalent for the left, or are they somewhere else?
That's a great question. And that's probably the number one question that I've gotten since doing this report. And there's a couple of answers to it. The first is that when we look at fake news largely, not just the stuff that's generated by extremists, but also the stuff that's generated for money, it tends to be on the right. And that's because it makes more money. People are far more likely to click on the pro-Trump, anti-Clinton, or anti-AOC or whatever content than they are the pro-leftist content. That's not to say there isn't fake news on the left. There is. There's sites like Occupy Democrats. There's stuff that's also very conspiratorial and very spurious. There's just a lot less of it. When we look at the landscape of fake news, we see that most of the content is right focusing. So it makes sense that more of it will be shared because people on the right are living within this news ecosystem that is very tilted towards the right. The second thing is we have to think about what is the far left? Like, what is the equivalent of white nationalists on the right? What is the left equivalent of that? And the groups that people usually identify are the quote unquote dirtbag left, like Chapo Trap House, and this sort of populist rhetoric around democratic socialism or the left. And those people, they're definitely putting out their message using social media, but they're not targeting particular groups. And they're also just not very good at it. When we look at the far left, we're looking at a bunch of different groups that have nothing to do with each other. We're looking at democratic socialists. We're looking at anarchists, we're looking at Black Lives Matter, we're talking about like radical feminists. None of these groups get along. None of them are very organized. None of them are willing to work together. They're often fighting over, differences of ideology. I think on the far right, we see this willingness to come together around ideological points of coalition. So one good example of this is when we were doing our field work, the Daily Stormer started putting out an edition in Spanish, which was shocking to us because the Daily Stormer is very, very anti-immigrant. But their goal is really the Jews. They hate the Jews, right? They hate the Jewish people of the world. And so they thought that they might be able to get some Spanish speakers in Spain or Argentina or something like that to get on their anti-Jewish bandwagon. And so that to them was more important than the racial difference at that particular time. So there's this willingness to coalition build on the right that I think makes them much better at doing this type of extremist propaganda.
Yeah, I mean, it makes me think of this, the Women's March recently and how they had a lot of infighting in terms of, especially on the Jewish issue. So, I mean, do you think it's not just in terms of internet technologies, but just a difference between the far right and the far left in general?
I mean, the far right is really, they are always squabbling about something. We said this many times in the report that these groups, people fall out with each other, people get sort of excommunicated. Just in the few years that we've been doing fieldwork, we've seen many rises and falls of different personalities. So there's lots and lots of infighting. I'm not saying there isn't. There's always infighting among political extremes, whether that's the right or the left. But I think that the right has this unifying principle, this unifying set of targets. They have this set of targets that's like feminists, Jews, immigrants, and they just kind of pound on that together. And they're willing to put the differences aside sometimes to just keep targeting these particular groups. I think that the left is different because the mainstream media, whether that's, the New York Times or the Washington Post, is seen to have a liberal slant already and often covers more leftist viewpoints. So there's a sense that they don't need to flood the internet with lots of extremist viewpoints because they're already appearing a little bit more in mainstream media. Although I would argue that many far left belief systems don't appear in mainstream media. And that's why we have a hard time thinking of what they are, right? So you don't see a lot of in-depth discussion of anarchism or in-depth discussion of lesbian separatism in the mainstream media. Like those viewpoints, the Overton window has not been opened enough to allow those viewpoints in.
I want to switch gears a bit and talk about two aspects of the report that I thought were particularly interesting. And one has to do with, I guess I'd call it ambiguity, and the other one is anonymity. But looking at ambiguity first, it seems that keeping the true meaning of a lot of these posts, we talk a little bit about this kind of coded imagery, et cetera, is a strategy. Like they sort of keep the meaning behind a lot of what they're putting out ambiguous. And they do this through humor. They do this through parody. And it relates to this idea of Poe's law, which I hadn't heard before reading the report, but I think it's super interesting. So could you describe what Poe's law is and how that parody element is important in these media manipulation strategies?
So Poe's law is this internet rule that without knowing someone's intent, it's impossible to tell if they're a troll or a parody or a quote unquote genuine kook. So someone who's really a nutty conspiracy theorist versus somebody who's trying to troll conspiracy theorists by pretending to be one. And a lot of the far right is this way. It's very hard sometimes to tell the difference between people who are trolling Nazis and people who are Nazis, people who are ironically sexist to critique sexism, and people who are really sexist. And this does two things. The first is it allows for plausible deniability. It allows people to hide behind trolling and irony to spread their messaging. So, for example, people like Milo Yiannopoulos claims that the alt-right only uses Nazi imagery to be ironic. So he uses the example of 80s metal bands who use satanic imagery. Like, what's going to shock your grandmother? White supremacist imagery. But this is really reinforced by the so-called alt-light media like Breitbart, which espouse the sort of more mainstream far-right talking points while strategically excluding the extreme beliefs such as scientific racism or anti-Semitism. So you could look at those and say, okay, there's not really this explicit racism in the alt-right. But the second reason for this is that it allows a cloak for actual white supremacists and neo-Nazis. So if you look at the Daily Stormer, Andrew Anglin, who runs the site, always talked about it as neo-Nazism masquerading as ironic neo-Nazism. So if you're using Nazi symbols and racist words and you're spreading xenophobic discourse, I don't care whether you think you're being ironic or not, you're spreading white supremacy. And when you have these areas that allow a lot of that kind of conversation in, under the auspices of it being ironic, it allows for real conversations around those issues to flourish.
Yeah, it's an interesting, dynamic I hadn't really thought so much about. And the second one I wanted to ask you is about anonymity, which is crucial for when you're sort of spreading hate speech online. Obviously, you don't want to be identified. And a lot of these boards, 4chan, 8chan, or social media platforms like Gab allow people to be anonymous. And one of the things I wanted to ask you about, and sort of looking at your CV and previous publications, is that you do a lot of work on these identitarian aspects of social media. So kind of branding yourself or being an influencer or micro celebrity. And so I wanted to ask, how do you see this anonymous aspect of these sites fitting in with your previous research, which had dealt a lot with using social media or the web as a way to sort of promote oneself? I mean, do these far-right groups get that type of reward by being anonymous?
In places like 4chan or 8chan, which allow people to be anonymous, you get people who I think are willing to say things that they wouldn't if they were tied to their real name. And we've seen this historically throughout the internet, that people are more likely to be open about, their medical issues or their family issues or, mental illness or depression or whatever. A lot of those things are much easier to talk about if it's not being linked to your quote unquote real world identity. So in a lot of these spaces, you have people who may live in really liberal places like Northern California or New York City, and they don't necessarily have people in their lives who share their white supremacist beliefs. And so in no way do they want this to come back to their actual identity, because it could have really serious impacts on their career and their future. So they're more comfortable participating in these communities because of the anonymity. And a lot of these groups really strongly protect their anonymity. And we see this on the left too, like Sleeping Giant, the group that tries to get ads pulled from far-right content, is very protective of their anonymity. There are also on the right people who participate because they want the status that being a provocateur gives them. So I think Milo Yiannopoulos is a really good example of this. He's a very sensationalist person. He came up during Gamergate. I don't care or know or care to know what his actual political commitments are, but it seems pretty clear that his number one commitment is just getting attention for himself. And he was able to do that for a fairly brief period of time by latching on to the far right, who generally would not claim a gay man with Jewish roots who's married to a black man, right? That's generally not what we think of when we think of the far right. And Milo's number one concern is just Milo, right? Getting attention. So he's definitely demonstrating these dynamics of influence. My co-author, Becca Lewis, has been working on alt-right and far-right influencers since the report came out. And she published a report probably 6 to 8 months ago on the Alternative Influence Network. And she's specifically looking at podcasters and YouTubers who guest on each other's podcasts. And the cult of personality around those types of people is enormous, and especially around people who are much more mainstream than the people that we focused on in our report. She found that even among people who are fairly centrist, right-wing kind of types, there's only one or two hops to the far right. So there is certainly that micro-celebrity dynamic, that status-seeking dynamic going on in the far right. It's just going on among different aspects of far-right media strategy.
Interesting. I have a couple last questions for you, and the first has to do with the political impact of these groups. So you outline in the report some examples of journalists being harassed, for example, sort of targeted strategies towards them. But I wanted to ask about, especially because, as you mentioned, this came about sort of because of the results of the 2016 election. I mean, do you think these groups have any effect on vote share, or is it just in kind of getting their message out in the media for lulz?
As a social scientist, I'm really hesitant to attribute causality to any of these dynamics. I think a lot of people are looking for an easy answer to why Trump beat Clinton in the 2016 election. I think, as we've seen, there is no easy answer. It was a confluence of factors that created this sort of perfect storm of craziness. But I think the biggest influence that these groups have had is that they put far-right issues on the table in a way that I think many of us thought would never happen again. That these discussions around, are Black people not as smart as white people? Like, many of us had thought those types of things, even if people were still thinking them or still acting upon them. Obviously, this structural racism is still like a very significant part of American culture. I think many of us had thought that we would not see these issues brought up in mainstream culture again. And I think that what the far right has done is it's been able to amplify a lot of these issues. I think there's often a through line between mainstream political beliefs and extremist political beliefs. Obviously, the extremist political beliefs are more extreme, but there's not that big of a difference between wanting to put up a border at the Mexican border and thinking that the United States should let nobody in, right? They're just different degrees on the same continuum. Or whereas the far right might say, Black Lives Matter is a dangerous terrorist organization that murders white people, there's plenty of mainstream Republicans who will say that Black Lives Matter is a hate group, right? So there's this continuum between these ideas. And I think it does allow for these extremist ideas to get into the public agenda and to gain currency, which I think means that they are more acceptable for people to act upon. So I think we can't think about it short-term and causal as like far-right extremism online leads to people voting for, far-right candidates. I think we need to think about how these issues are being brought up in mainstream political discourse and how they're being enacted in public policy. We also need to think about trust in the mainstream media, because one of the biggest things we've seen is that trust in institutions has dropped precipitously in the last 20 years, especially among people in the right. There's less trust of universities, of journalists, of government, all of these things. And when groups that are very cynical about the media, so these trolls and ideologues and conspiracy theorists, are able to successfully use the media to cover a story or push an agenda, it undermines the media's credibility on other issues. And we know that there are civic ramifications for mistrust in the media, that it increases strictly partisan voting, that it weakens the political knowledge of citizens, that it inhibits the mainstream media's ability to be a watchdog. And so I think that to the extent that they're decreasing trust in media across the board, I think that's a really big problematic impact.
Yeah. And my last question for you has to deal with, do you know of any initiatives that are being undertaken to counter this activity? Because, while these boards like 4chan and 8chan are, anonymous and it's hard to identify the actual users, I'm sure that government agencies know about these groups and what's going on there. So I wanted to ask, do you know of any sort of countermeasures that either governments, institutions, independent actors are taking in order to sort of counter this discourse online?
I think the biggest success has been no platforming. The fact that a lot of these groups were on Twitter, were on YouTube, were on Facebook when we were doing our research, and now many of them no longer have those platforms to spread their messages, I think is really important. For like a straight year, we were pointing to Alex Jones as one of the biggest purveyors of disinformation and misinformation, and YouTube was really resistant to kicking him off the platform until finally they did. And I think that's a big success, because there's a big link between monetization and mainstream platforms. And so continuing to deplatform and no platform groups, I think is really important. And there's a bunch of groups that are still working on that, including the Southern Poverty Law Center. Another big initiative has been to try to decrease the amount of amplification through algorithms that far-right groups get. And this has been a very difficult problem to solve. YouTube has consistently come under fire for amplifying extremist voices. And for whatever reason, it seems that every week there's another story about how some other horrible viewpoint is being surfaced on YouTube or whatever. And so that, I think, is an effort that's ongoing. In terms of the individual actors, what we see in the US is that there's much less emphasis on domestic terrorism from white people than there is from people of color, just like across the board. And the rise of the alt-right and things like Charlottesville, I think, pointed to the fact that the police has a very difficult time working with organized white supremacy, and that the dangers of white supremacist groups have been consistently underestimated and underacted upon by the mainstream police, by the Justice Department, et cetera. And because I think there's a lot of ties between some of these extremist right-wing groups and mainstream right-wing politics, and because we are in a political cycle where the Senate and the president are both held by the right, I don't see a lot of action on that. So I think much of the political pressure I've seen has come from citizen groups and activist groups working to try to get some of these actors off the social media platforms that we use every day.
Well, Dr. Marwick, it's been a slightly troubling but also very interesting conversation. So thank you so much for taking the time and coming on the podcast.
Oh, thanks for having me. It's been great.
I've just been speaking with Dr. Alice Marwick, Assistant Professor of Communication at UNC Chapel Hill. And that'll do it for this episode of the Social Media and Politics Podcast. Thank you so much for tuning in. Next time, I'll be speaking with Adam Meldrum from AdVictory to talk about the use of AI and chatbots in American political campaigning. But until then, I'm your host, Michael Becerra, signing off from Copenhagen. See you next time.